SBC Media.
Welcome to iGaming Daily, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe, supported by the Casino Beat Summit, bringing you the future of play, iGaming strategy, innovation and development.
Be part of the future of play at the Casino Beat Summit in Malta this May. See new game releases, attend engaging workshops, dive into the technical side, and take in our star-studied and innovation-focused conference agenda. All this, plus a packed networking schedule, where you can rub shoulders with the casino elite at some of the hottest venues on the island. Get your tickets now at sbcevents.com.
This week, the UK's National Health Service, the NHS, published the second part of its 2021 Health Survey for England that describes gambling participation and the prevalence of at-risk and problem gambling. This chapter of the report looks at the types of gambling activities that all adults aged 16 or over have taken part in the last 12 months. According to the NHS, this is defined as having spent money on a gambling activity. In the report, prevalence of gambling is compared across different groups, including by region, household income, and index of multiple deprivation, IMD. Validated scales such as the Problem Gambling Severity Index, the PGSI, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 4th version, also known as the DSM-4, are used to estimate the prevalence of at-risk and problem gambling. In today's episode of the iGaming Daily podcast, Andrew McCarron, SBC's Managing Director, joins me to look over and provide his thoughts on some of the key findings of the report. Andy, thank you for joining me today. How are you doing? And have you managed to shake the jet lag from SBC Summit North America last week?
I took most of the jet lag on the chin on Saturday when my other half was hosting a Eurovision party, during which I only fell asleep twice. So, meant everybody enjoyed themselves.
Yeah, my other half was also watching Eurovision, but thankfully she kicks me out of the room every year when she watches it. So once Ben, my 5-month-old baby, was asleep, I managed to get some sleep as well. But we're here today to talk about the NHS figures from their new report, or the second part of the report, shall we say. To start off with, it's probably best for you to provide a bit of an overview of some of the key findings from the results. So could you just provide the listeners what those findings were?
Sure. The NHS Health Survey for England, they do a separate one for Scotland, is just the way that we've been measuring gambling participation and, by extension, problem gambling for the last couple of years. Originally, and this was always the intention when the Gambling Act was set up in 2005, there was going to be regular, maybe every 2 or 3 years, a specific study for gambling prevalence, just to make sure we had the figures on how society was adapting to these new laws, what needed tweaking, any red flags. Unfortunately, when the global recession came at the end of 2010, the new government came in that year and started an austerity program, which unfortunately involved cutting the funding of this prevalence study. So the Gambling Commission had to find different ways. The Gambling Commission and the DCMS, is the government department in charge of gambling, had to find different ways of monitoring what was going on. So they ended up being folded into this health survey, which covers a lot of other things. But that's been the standard now for the last couple of years. But it's obviously a much more light touch survey on gambling because it involves so many different other things. But that's the standard we've had to use for. That's the quality of the data we've had to go. It's the closest thing we've got to what you would deem official figures. The Gambling Commission have recently done their own telephone surveys on a quarterly basis, but this is supposed to be the highest quality one so far. Again, it's not the best, but it's what we've got. It's what we've got. So, I mean, the good news is going from the problem gambling side of things is the trend is lower people recording themselves as having problem gambling issues. And that's kind of been reflected in some of the Gambling Commission's telephone surveys as well. It's a funny thing. You always get coverage in the national media when problem gambling rates go up. When they go down, it's tricky. It's tricky to find any coverage of it. I mean, there is a caveat with these findings in that it's covering 2021, and as we know, we keep forgetting these things. 2021 was still completely in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So that skews a little bit of data collection, it skews a little bit of reporting, skews a lot of people's activities. So whether it's possible to compare them to previous ones, it's not as comparable. And that's always the key with these surveys, to have something that you can compare with to see what the trend is. If we've had a few things in the past when it comes to gambling research where they've tweaked something, like the Gambling Commission's own research into youth gambling, shall we say, that tweaked the age ranges, which ended up making it incomparable to the ones that had gone before. But the headline rate was so many more extra kids are gambling, when the new survey actually included a subsection of people where they were legal to gamble. So it really skewed comparisons, to be fair.
Why do they skew these? Why do they change some things to make them not comparable? Because that doesn't seem beneficial in a sense, because you can't compare from the previous year if that's the case. Yeah,
I mean, there's the problem, and we'll go into this a little bit later on when we're talking about the DSM 4 and DSM 5 scales, is you want to improve stuff. And sometimes if you improve too much, or at least try to improve too much, too quickly, you can't compare them, but you end up having a better survey. So there's got to be a bit of give and take. But in England, at least, which tends to be a decent proxy for the rest of Britain, 50% of adults had participated in a gambling activity in the previous 12 months, with men more likely than women to take part, but not by an awful lot.
I was going to ask that. It states as a key finding, and if you actually look at some of the other votes that we've had in England, you had Brexit, which was, I think I've got it here, 52% and 48% to leave the EU. That was deemed close. Scottish referendum, which was Scotland leaving the UK to become independent, that was voted more closely to these, which was 55.3 and 44.7 in favour or against independence. Why is it deemed as a key finding when in other results in England it seemed as a close result?
Well, I think the key finding here is it's half of people.
Oh, so it's just so evenly split.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's 45% of women, 55% of men, which is, it's broadly comparable. What the other interesting key findings, which doesn't, I'll be honest with you, doesn't feel right to me. It says 10% of adults had participated in any online gambling in the previous 12 months.
And that's the year everyone was in lockdown, pretty much, or there was a lot of lockdowns.
Yes. It's during a COVID time when a lot of the land-based gambling facilities were shut. So just 10%, even on a normal year, 10% feels a bit low, if I'm honest with you.
Do we know any reasons why it's such a low figure? Was there anything in the report to highlight that? Is there anything that you think might point to that?
I think it might just be a data error, if I'm honest with you. I don't see anything that particularly highlights why it should just be 10%. Again, it depends. 2021 was a bit of a transitional year coming out of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it depends when these participants would ask the question, really,
Mm-hmm.
and if they could remember. That's the thing with these questionnaires. It's liable to participant bias, but like I said earlier, it's the best we've got. The best we've got at the moment. So one of the other key findings, as I mentioned before, is the problem gambling rates. So the health survey found that problem gambling rates amongst adults was 0.4%. Now, the previous rate, which was the one in 2018, again, as I said, it's not a perfect comparison just because of everything that went on in that time. The previous rate was 0.5.
Okay.
The longer-term trend, certainly when we had the full-on prevalence studies, was around 0.7. And these quarterly ones from the Gambling Commission have had this rate even as low as 0.2, which is... I don't trust the Gambling Commission pure numbers, but the trend is being reflected here of lower problem gambling reporting.
Can I just ask why you don't trust the Gambling Commission numbers?
They are very light touch. The number of participants isn't particularly significant for it to be a really robust figure. But the Gambling Commission recognise this, and they're currently doing another survey another consultation actually to discuss how they collate this information. Unfortunately, they did a pilot test last year, and it wasn't particularly well done, and it was rushed a little bit, as a lot of the consultations seem to be. I think we'll find that an awful lot of rushed consultations over the next 12 months, given the government white paper. But the rough figure they had of problem gambling from that pilot scheme, I think it was last year now, was so different to this. There's an awful lot more work that needs to go into it. I think it was as high as 1.2. But yeah, so it's an area that the Gambling Commission need to do some work in and are doing some work in. But yeah, it's just a shame that the funding was pulled from those prevalence studies, those full-on prevalence studies, because the scheme of things, it wasn't that much money at the time. It was like £250,000.
When was it pulled?
So the last one was in 2010. There should have been one in 2012 or 2013. But given the government cost cutting at the time, it's one of the first things to go, which was a shame. It's a bit of a false economy, really, considering we're trying to make decisions now based on substandard information. We've got gambling participation, but we are where we are with that. So the latest Gambling Commission quarterly survey found that the UK's adult problem gambling rates was 0.3%. Again, these are low internationally, and they're certainly lower than they've been in the last 15 years. Even at the time, 0.7 was seen quite low. And even up until a year and a half, 2 years ago, the Gambling Commission was saying that the rate was stable. It had not changed too much. So
before you jump, you said these are low internationally. I don't know if you have these figures on hand at now. But if we compare them to other Western markets, are we kind of low end of the barrel when it comes to these kind of figures, or is there still room for improvement?
It's hard to say. Cultural differences are so different. I mean, the problem gambling rate in Australia, if you ever go to Australia, they're mad gamblers. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely eye-opening. When you think UK is quite an advanced gambling market, Australian gambling culture is off the scale compared to the UK. But you have other places, I mean, even like in the US, where they've essentially had a prohibition on sports betting. Didn't stop there being a high problem gambling rate prevalence. So it's all down to the different cultures. But generally the UK is recognised to be one of the lower and more stable ones. And this is despite online gambling coming on, the marketing being everywhere. It's not shifted this dial. So it's a funny one when there's so much noise around how bad gambling is when things haven't necessarily changed, at least not changed for the worse, that we can see from the official, in inverted commas, data that we've got.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I think the white paper from a couple of weeks ago just tinkered around the edges a bit when it came to that sort of stuff. One thing that does irritate me a little bit about the reporting of this, of the problem gambling rates, and certainly there's a big health lobby going absolutely mad on gambling of late. In a political way, I mean, they want gambling to come under the Department of Health, want all the funding to go to the NHS. The NHS didn't care about gambling addiction 3 or 4 years ago, and all the NHS centres specifically dealing with problem gambling were actually funded by the industry itself. But one of the main measures that's used for problem gambling is the Problem Gambling Severity Index, the PGSI. PGSI gives you 9 questions and has, if you answer yes to 8 or 9 of those, you're deemed a problem gambler. But there's also this big subset called at risk. So if you answer yes to 1 or 2, you're deemed a low at risk problem gambler. And there's a medium one and there's a high one. But what these surveys tend to do, everyone skews figures to their own agenda. What these tend to do is bundle in all the at risk participants with the problem gambling participants, so they've got a bigger figure. And obviously, with these 9 questions, if you answer 1 question yes, much different to the person that's answered 8 questions yes. So I'm not sure how helpful that is, bundling all those together. I mean, if you put those at high risk with those that are classified as problem gamblers, I think that's more useful, but they don't do it. It's just any at-risk gambler is bundled in with the problem gambling rate.
Why are they being bundled, do you think?
Headline figures.
It's the agenda.
More or less. Or people are just seeing at risk and not drilling down into it and seeing what at risk actually means. Mm-hmm. Or, you know, it's more of a spectrum rather than right, they're at risk. It's a wide spectrum. I mean, I'm on the, funnily enough, it's Responsible Gambling Victoria site. It's one of the few places that I've seen just some of the questions for the PGSI. First question is, have you bet more than you could really afford to lose? I mean, if you go to any race day in the UK, sometimes you bet over your budget. So if you said yes to that, you're at-risk gambler already, and you're being bundled in with people who've got problem gambling. It's just too low a bar to be bundled in with the rest with those that have got real problems, in my opinion. Another one is, have you needed to gamble with larger amounts of money to get the same feeling of excitement? Have you gone back another day to try and win back the money you lost? Have you borrowed money or sold anything to gamble? I mean, obviously, that's a really strong one. Have you felt you might have a problem with gambling? Well, given how many problem gambling adverts there are, you'd be stupid not to self-assess. Every time you go into sign up a new account, you're asked to put in customer deposit limits and stuff like that. So just doing that, you might answer yes to that.
Subconsciously, it might be in the back of your head.
Yeah. Depends how guilty of a person you are, how self-reflective you are. But, you start answering yes to some of these. Have people criticised your betting or told that you had a gambling problem, whether or not you thought it was true? I mean, I can see why this has been included, but stigma that's been put on gambling, and it's always been a vice. How if someone's nagging you, for want of a better phrase, for putting a bet on the national, that probably won't happen. But putting a football bet on every week, oh, you're going to the bookies again. If instead of doing the hoovering or something, you're then classified at risk, and sometimes bundled in with the problem gamblers. So it's too wide. But this is one of the negatives of the PGSI score, or at least it's one of the few scores specifically for problem gambling. There's a light touch one, which is what this one is, and there's a more in-depth one as well. And the other way of measuring is the DSM-4 /5 methodology.
Yeah, can you we are just running out of time. Can you just briefly explain what that is?
So the DSM, I can't quite remember what it stands for, but it basically classifies mental issues.
Mm-hmm.
So addiction being one of them. It's one of the few clinical scales that measures problem gambling amongst addiction to other things, amongst schizophrenia. You know, they're all measured with using these clinical terms. And the DSM-4 scale was updated to DSM-5 a good couple of years ago, but a lot of the surveys still use DSM-4 for the comparable reasons, because it's much harder, stupid as it sounds, much harder to compare results from DSM-5 to those from DSM-4, just because it's slightly different methodology.
Okay, and kind of just to round off this podcast, you mentioned previously in this episode about the Gambling Act Review. So with further consultations on the Gambling Act Review due, could these NHS figures, these stats, have any kind of influence on implementations of white paper recommendations moving forward?
They should. They should give, certainly the Gambling Commission, although some people say they have their own agenda at the moment to tighten regulations no matter what. But what it should do is it should give politicians pause for thought before implementing anything too extreme. Not too extreme, but anything over the top, when certainly the official results suggest that problem gambling certainly isn't getting worse.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this could be a question that we put to Andrew Rhodes next week, the CEO of the UKGC at Casino Beats Summit. He will be attending, he will be speaking on a panel session, so it might be something we pitch his way.
I've got a feeling if Andrew Rhodes has agreed to answer all the questions the industry have got, he'll still be there next month.
Perfect. So, Andy, thank you for taking time out of your day to just talk through these figures and just, to provide a bit more detail into them. For the listeners out there, if you want to find any further information on these NHS figures, visit sbcnews.co.uk. And again, Andy, thank you. To the listeners, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of iGaming Daily, brought to you in conjunction with the Casino Beats Summit, being held at the Intercontinental Malta on the 23rd to the 25th of May. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network, or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.